Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this preview webcast of Strata New York. We started the Strata conference series early this year in February in Santa Clara and had an amazing response, a sellout show. And one of the reasons that we're doing Strata is that we recognize that what's going on with data in the world now, with our ability to process large amounts of scruffy data in an experimental way as well as an ordered way, is leading to a change in business and in society and in what it means for us personally. It's now so much cheaper to get value out of data. You know, the industrial or commercial giants in the last 10 years, Walmart, McDonald's, and so on, they were able to afford the means of extracting value from their big data. But now we're in an era where that's available to so many more of us, and it's changing how we think, and it's changing how even you might think the more normal aspects of doing business and living our lives are concerned. So I'm very glad to have a faculty of speakers this morning drawn from the various three events in Strata, New York. But before we go on, I'm just going to give a word about our sponsor, who is EMC. EMC have been great supporters of the Strata conference right from the beginning. One of the interesting things about this is that Scott Yara, who's the CEO of Greenplum and now part of EMC, was lobbying Tim O'Reilly for about 3 years to do a data conference. And it was great to have him at our opening in February to kind of tell the story of where this new discipline called data science had come from. And so thanks very much to them, and I should point out there they have a bunch of products really aimed for big data processing in the enterprise. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker this morning, who is Mike Nelson. Michael comes from the Leading Edge Forum. One of the interesting things that captivated me about what Michael's going to talk about is the way he's leaning in to what's happening with data right now. In this age of WikiLeaks, you can't really contain the information that your company has, and leaking is becoming an unavoidable part of life. So he's going to talk to us about how actually you can turn that to your advantage and what business ought to do in an age where information flows freely. So Michael is part of our Jumpstart faculty who are going to be speaking on the 19th of September in New York, and I'm glad to turn it over to him now. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm very glad to be on the program for Jumpstart and very glad to have a chance to try to compress all my key points into about 15 or 20 minutes this morning. I've been working here in Washington for about 23 years, and I've only recently joined the CSC Leading Edge Forum. Prior to that, I worked in the Clinton White House. I worked before that in the Senate, and I spent a lot of time working at IBM. And in all of these situations, there was this great desire to control information, to understand exactly who was talking to whom, how information was being shared. But the game is changing, and one of the topics that I think we need to focus a lot more on is how we deal with big data in the era of WikiLeaks. And in particular, how you develop a transparency strategy. Rather than letting your employees and former employees and disgruntled employees leak information out to the press or to their blogs or to Twitter, companies have to have a proactive policy for sharing more of the data that in the past they've always assumed they were just going to sit on. This talk that I'm doing is the result of a project I've been working on for about 5 months for the forum. I'm almost wrapping it up, but it's part of ongoing research, and I would invite anybody on the call who has a particular story about transparency or strategic leaking to send me a note at mnelson@pobox.com or mnelson@leadingedgeforum.com. This is a relatively new phenomenon, but it's one that's going to be, I think, more and more important in the coming months and years. I've worked with Tim O'Reilly for about 20 years, and I've always been impressed with how he spots a trend early, gets the right people together to talk about it, and really helps drive the debate. And I think that's what's going to happen here is we talk more about big data and particularly talk about transparency. The first slide here shows what's really going on. There's this explosion in the amount of data that companies collect and store. At the same time, there's more and more necessity to share information, both throughout the company and with business partners. We've seen that in government after 9/11, huge focus on data sharing between the agencies working on anti-terrorism, but it's happening throughout the economy as companies outsource more and more of their core functions. And that means that the amount of control that companies have over that information is inevitably going to decrease. You can do a better job with cybersecurity. You can do a better job of understanding who has access to what. But at the end of the day, your ability to make sure that nothing goes out the door that you don't want to go out the door is going to go down. Next slide is just to remind us about WikiLeaks, which I think is a great case study in what's really going on. Government agencies had to share the information that was in the databases that were leaked in the WikiLeaks incident. They had to get that data out to about 500,000 people who were in the business of tracking possible terrorist threats, trying to understand what was going on in the Middle East. There was a real need to get that data out, and at the same time, they didn't do a good enough job of making sure that all 500,000 people who had access to those databases were monitored properly. And so just one of them, Bradley Manning, was able to leak more than 250,000 documents and cause all sorts of embarrassment for the U.S. State Department and for governments around the world. What's interesting about that is the reaction. The first reaction was from governments was panic and just a real focus on locking everything down. They went even further and tried to actually impede or block what WikiLeaks was doing. That hasn't prevented a lot of other groups from popping up that are doing the same thing as WikiLeaks, including the Wall Street Journal and Al Jazeera. Businesses have responded to WikiLeaks by asking the question, what if this happened to us? And their reaction, of course, has been to lock things down. But that's not actually the right reaction. And some companies are looking at the WikiLeaks story and realizing that actually there's a lot of data that they've been locking down that they shouldn't be locking down. There's information that's going to get out, and they might as well let it get out and make sure it gets out in the right form to the right people. There was a great article in The Economist back in February. It came out just a few weeks before we started this project called The Leaky Corporation. And it really looks at this new environment and explains, as only The Economist can, what the trends are and what some examples of how this is happening. There's lots of reasons to be more transparent, to share more information. This 2x2 matrix gives you a sense of the benefits. On the vertical axis, you have value creation. If you share more data with your customers, with your partners, and if you share more data externally, it also ends up being more accessible to your own employees. If you do that, you can get more new services out the door. You can work more closely with your partners. You can generate a lot of publicity. And one of the big intangible benefits is trust. If you were telling people what you're doing about tell people about the new services you're developing, if you're showing them how you operate and what your corporate ethic is, there's going to be a higher degree of trust. The other big benefit of transparency, of course, is accountability. If you're telling the world what you're doing, you're going to be more accountable. If your employees have their name out there on blog postings describing what they're doing, they're going to have to be more accountable, more productive, more creative. So these are the two focus areas that we've looked at in this report, and both of them are incredibly important. They're important not just for businesses, but also for governments and nonprofits. Different companies are going to have different reasons to become more transparent. But the bottom line here is that they're going to be more transparent whether they want to or not. And I would argue that we're going to see a lot more cases like WikiLeaks. There's a lot more bloggers out there trying to figure out what's going on inside a company. And with social media, there's a lot more ways for information to leak out. We recently had a case where a vice president at Hewlett-Packard updated his LinkedIn profile and just happened to mention a great, exciting new project that he was working on in cloud computing. He was actually the point person on the project. Well, that wasn't a public program. It wasn't supposed to be out. They hadn't announced it yet. And that's just, again, one little example of how social media is changing the way in which information leaves companies. In this talk I'm giving in September, I'll be looking at 9 different areas of transparency. And they range from the C-suite. The first item, of course, is what is the CEO thinking, and the CFO and the CIO. There's been a lot of talk about this over the last 10 years, starting with Don Tapscott in his book, The Naked Corporation. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to focus on some of the other areas that are getting more attention now. The second topic is about research, sharing your new product ideas, sharing your source code. Third area of transparency is about your personnel. Startups are particularly good at that, showing people the bios and projects that each employee is involved in. In some cases, even sharing compensation numbers, telling people what your employees get paid. That's kind of extreme, but there are companies that practice radical transparency. They let the whole world know what's going on. Fourth item is sales goals and figures, telling the world product by product how well they're selling and how successful they are. Fifth item is a very rich topic, and it's one I'll spend a lot of time talking about in my talk at Jumpstart, and that is about customer data, usually anonymized and aggregated. But there's a lot of very exciting projects going on where taking all the data from customers, not just sales, but preferences and the rest, companies are able to provide back to their customers very detailed profiles of what different customers are doing, providing information on everything from what books sell best on Amazon to what's the favorite restaurant in your neighborhood. The sixth item is customer complaints and resolution. Again, this is being forced upon companies. If you don't publicize the comments and critiques that you're getting and show what you've done about them, you're missing an opportunity, because those complaints are going to be on Yelp or TripAdvisor or Angie's List or some of these consumer sites, whether you take action or not. Ninth item is pricing and purchasing data. Again, this varies with industry, but there are places where companies are doing a much better job of being transparent about exactly what their prices are, and customers appreciate that, often leading to increased sales, if not increased profit. Eighth item is just everyday operations, and this, again, is a very rich and sort of grab bag topic, but there are more and more opportunities for companies to share with the world the kind of information they get on their corporate dashboards, to put webcams at their various facilities, and just let the world know how things work. I'll say more about this shortly. And then the last point is crisis response, particularly important in a crisis, whether it's an oil spill in the Gulf or a product recall, to be out there, to be transparent, to be seen as being open and honest. And if a company has a reputation already for being transparent, it's much easier to respond when the crisis comes. I think that by being more transparent, companies can really resolve an issue that they've been facing for more than 20 years, and that is the tension between the amount of information that customers are willing to share and the amount of information that vendors want to get. If you're running an e-commerce site, you need to know who you're talking to. You'd like to know a lot of different information to establish identity, phone number, address, social security number, credit card, and the rest. And customers, of course, would prefer to be anonymous or to share as little as possible. So this diagram is sort of where we've been for the last 20 years, and governments are in this debate. They're trying to set standards and decide what information can be shared and should be shared. The next slide just shows some of the benefits that a vendor gets by having more personalized information. They can customize the offerings, they can generate more profits by doing that, and of course they can cut down on fraud. But again, customers would prefer to be on the left side of this diagram for protecting their privacy, sharing as little as possible. So I think transparency is sort of the answer to this problem. If we get away from a one-dimensional debate and we add in a second dimension, we start talking about transparency of processes and systems. If companies share information about what they're doing with your data, you're going to be more willing to share data. I call this mutually assured disclosure, and it's a form of strategic leaking. If I'm Amazon and I share with you all the information I have on your purchases, and then tell me how that data is being used, how it's being aggregated, how customized offerings are possible because I've shared that information, I'm much more willing to share information and perhaps move off of my stance of sharing as little as possible. So this is one of the benefits. I'm not going to go onto this next slide very much, but it's an attempt to look at what influences how transparent a company can be. The most important factor that we found in the study is CEO and board commitment to more openness. And often it takes a top-down effort to open up the company. And a number of the case studies that I'll be examining started that way. But there are other factors. In an industry where things are changing very fast, there's more and more interest in what's going on, what companies are developing, so more and more pressure to be open. In companies where you're working, you have a very intense relationship with a customer, where you're selling things every few days or at least every few weeks, there's going to be interest in how the company operates. On the other hand, if you're an insurance company and maybe you renew a policy once a year, there may be less interest in that kind of thing. So I won't go through all of this, but this is something I'll explore in New York. So the next slide is just an example of some of the case studies that I explore. The first one is an old example. It's a company called Simco. Ricardo Simler was the CEO of that. He took over the company, which is a high-tech manufacturing company in Brazil, when he was 24 years old. And at the time, the company was very top-down, very hierarchical. Everything was on a need-to-know basis, and he completely changed the culture. He announced that they were just going to make everything available. They were going to share salary information, product plans. He fired about two-thirds of his staff, his senior direct reports, and just changed the way the company worked. The assumption was information would be shared internally and externally, and the incredible growth rate, just a very dramatic increase in the amount of attention the company got, and it became much easier for them to recruit people as well. Another example they use is Custom Ink. It's a custom T-shirt printing company right here in Falls Church, Virginia. It has the largest chunk of that market, and they've been very transparent about the complaints they get, and put that right on their home page as a way to highlight what they're doing to ensure quality. Intuit is a good example of a company that's using customer data to generate more services for their own customers. So if you go to data.mint.com, you can see how Intuit customers are spending their money. And I can find out which are the most popular restaurants among Mint.com customers in Arlington, Virginia, where I live. Or if I'm looking for a car repair shop, I can get a sense of which ones are most expensive based on how large the bills are of the various people who are using the service in my area. Another example is the Netflix prize, which you're probably familiar with. Netflix decided they wanted to do a better job of predicting what movies their customers would enjoy viewing. And so they made available a large chunk, millions of records, hundreds of millions of records from millions of customers. And then they challenged anybody who was interested to come up with a better algorithm for determining which movies people would like based on what other movies they've liked in the past. And this was a very creative use of anonymized data, which led to a much better algorithm as well as a lot of publicity. Cost them $1 million in prize money, and they probably got tens of millions of dollars worth of creative research done as a result. So the bottom line is that you really need to have a transparency strategy, a conscious, well-thought-out strategy for sharing more information. It's really just the opposite of the security strategy and the privacy and compliance policies that companies already have. Those are focused on controlling what information goes where. This has to be the flip side of the coin. How do you take the information that has always been treated as confidential and make it available and benefit from it and leverage it? When I was in the Clinton White House, we had a very simple rule, which was put it on the web unless there's a good reason not to. And Obama went one further. In his very first executive order, they set out a transparency strategy that said, we're going to make data available and we're going to put it in a format that people can use easily. Implementation's been hard, but they certainly have made some steps there, and the top-down leadership has been helpful. So what do you do? In this talk, I'm focusing primarily on management and culture, not so much on bits and bytes. But one thing you obviously need to do is you have to get a team together that includes the key parts of the company, from the IT office to the human resources office, communications, public relations, and legal. They have to sit down and think, okay, what data do we have that we should be making available? And think about pilot projects that can actually demonstrate the power of sharing. One place to go for some information on how to do this is a group called World Blue, BLU, which has actually created transparency metrics that allow companies to measure themselves and determine how transparent they are and how they could become more open and transparent. There are lots of implications for IT infrastructure. I won't have time to go into all of them, but clearly you need to have better identity management so you know who you're talking to, who you're sharing with, both internally and externally. A real big challenge is getting more fine-grained access control. So rather than just giving everybody in a certain part of the company access to all the databases in a particular area, you might end up giving a lot more people access to those databases, but not giving them access to all of the database. So certain columns might only be available with passwords, or there might be a particular high level of security for those particular pieces of the database, which might include social security numbers, credit cards, and the like. The real challenge here is to move from the old model, where you had a little bit of very high-risk information. In some cases, this is intellectual property. Other cases, it's financial results, personnel data. And then you had everything else in the company that was internal and was confidential and was treated that way, and that was supposed to stay inside the company. And then you had press releases and web postings, and tightly controlled by the PR organization. The new model, very different. You still have the high-risk information. You might even have more than you used to have. It has to be treated very carefully. But then you also have a lot of information you're going to want to get out the door, and you're going to allow to go out the door. Let me show this in a graphical form. In a typical company, you have a lot of different information assets, and the value of those assets and the amount of damage that could be done if they were leaked varies. So as you go from left, this is actually a slide from one of my colleagues at the Leading Edge Forum, Adrian Secombe, and he's trying to show how different types of information can cause damage if they're released. In this classic approach, everything is treated as confidential. There's a rather high expense in trying to protect everything in the company. And then there's the really special stuff that needs extra protection and extra expense is needed. The result is, though, a lot of money is wasted putting high levels of control on information that could be publicly available. And so one of the big challenges here is to go to a more multi-tiered classification scheme and a multi-tiered security policy so that you accept that a lot of information, routine information about the company, and it might be personnel information about bios and who's working on what. It may be some information on products. It may even be some anonymized customer data. That information you should be ready to let out the door, perhaps even put out the door. So this is a big challenge and one that a few companies are starting to grapple with already. And that leads me to my last slide, which is really a slide of next practices. At CSC and the Leading Edge Forum, we don't focus on best practices. We try to look at next practices. What are the emerging protocols and procedures that companies are using to tackle new opportunities and to meet new challenges? Obviously, as I said, there is a need to bring together the key players and to actually ask the question, what data should we be protecting? What data do we need to protect? And then going further down the line to develop strategies for training employees and for taking advantage of transparency. So I know I've almost run out of time. I do see one question here about my very first chart, which is showing how control is going down. I want to stress I'm not saying that things are out of control. Clearly, if you make the investment, you can control the data that you need to control. But there is so much data that information is going to leak out. And some of it is information you won't collect. There are going to be people collecting data about your company just by watching you, by watching web traffic, by putting webcams up. I mean, you have bloggers who are following Apple engineers into bars and listening to their conversations. There's so many ways in which information is leaking out. So the diagram, just going back to that diagram, the reason that such a sharp descent in the control curve is because I was trying to measure the likelihood that you will control everything that leaks out of your company. It just isn't possible. And so you need this strategy for strategic leaking to get more people informed about what you're doing, to build trust, build buzz, and make better use of the data you have. So I hope that gives you a preview of what I'm going to talk about. And again, if people have questions and would like more detail on this or learn more about how to get copies of the reports that we're working on in this area, you can send me a note at mnelson@leadingedgeforum.com. I'll also post that in the chat room. So thank you very much,
Michael. So thank you. Really appreciate your presentation. I love the phrase mutually assured disclosure, which I think is definitely one that captures the imagination. We're going to move on shortly to our next speaker, but I had one question for you, which I guess you must get a lot. Apple Computer seems to be a strong counterexample to what you're saying in terms of their fervent strategy of control, and they don't seem to be doing too badly on it.
Well, it's interesting. One of the other examples I point to is Google. Google's also famous. Stephen Levy wrote this wonderful book called In the Plex, and he compared Google to a lobster. Very hard shell on the outside and very open and soft on the inside. So I think Google has an approach that is probably most relevant to a lot of companies. They're struggling to make sure that everybody on the inside has all the data they need to do new and exciting things, and yet they don't want to tell the world about the new products they're developing and the new strategies they have. And so they have very clear rules on what can be shared and what can't be. I do think there are companies, there are businesses that are going to ignore transparency. They're just going to do everything they can to keep everything locked up. And that's in many cases for regulatory reasons Or if you're a defense contractor and half of what you do is classified, you clearly aren't going to be putting out detailed bios on what all of your employees are working on. Apple does it because they like to generate buzz by putting new exciting things out the door and making a big to-do about it. The problem, though, is that there is leaking going on. People are doing a much better job of finding out what Apple's plans are. In some cases, they're getting information from vendors who are working with Apple, contractors. Other cases, they're just talking to loose-lipped engineers. So I think in the long run, companies are going to have a harder and hard time doing what Apple's doing. I mean, Apple has other advantages. I'm not saying that transparency is the answer, but particularly in businesses where you have to be part of an ecosystem, where your success depends on 10 other companies working with you, transparency is going to be a competitive advantage.
Thank you very much. I definitely look forward to hearing you expand on Monday, September 19th, part of the Jumpstart program.